Evening all. Happy Sunday. Stephen here, as you know. Beer up, boy creeping in. Tamper in hand. Smoking my Bayard. And in it I've got some Cornell and Deal Autumn Evening. And I'm drinking, cheers. Happy Sunday, good health all. Cheers boy, cheers. A good old bottle of Bass. We've been brewing this stuff in the UK since the late 18th century. That red triangle was the first ever registered trademark in the UK. That's why it says #1 under here. So, trademark #1. First ever registered trademark, that red triangle for Bass. What am I listening to? It's another one of my series, haphazard series of rather more obscure albums. This is an album from 1979 by a British experimental musician that went by the name of, and still goes by the name of, Anthony Moore. And he was a founder member of a group called Slap Happy, which were like an avant rock band, which sort of was the next stage on from prog rock in the 70s. But he produced this himself, wrote all the songs, played a lot of instruments on it, did the backing vocals himself, and ended up, because he couldn't get a record deal, in the true punk spirit, driving around and delivering these to record shops himself. I really like it. It's an album called Flying Doesn't Help. For some reason he went by the name of A. Moore, M-O-R-E, but it's actually Anthony Moore, M-O-O-R-E, if you're interested. Flying Doesn't Help. Funnily enough, with this series, which has not got very far so far, I found in copyright terms it's harder to actually play these lesser well-known albums than it is the big names. I can only assume it's because, you know, they're not big names, they didn't make mega bucks, and so they're more protective of their intellectual copyright. I don't know. So I've had to shelve quite a few so far that I was planning to play. Let's stick a log on. Get it roaring. Cheers. How we all be. Last night and tonight, well, basically it's all dates surrounding the 5th of November. Here in the UK, the 5th of November is a night that every dog owner, dog lover hates. It's called the 5th of November tomorrow. It's Guy Fawkes night in the UK, or bonfire night as it's also colloquially known, fathers up and down the land risk life and limb letting off explosives in the back garden, often after they've had a couple of sherbets as well. And setting light to themselves or their house, or even worse, their neighbour's house. And the dogs hate it. Ziggy is terrified of the fireworks. Which, why wouldn't he be? He's got no concept of what fireworks are. All he knows is there's these huge explosions going off without reason. But it's something we've always celebrated since, you know, when I was a kid, Halloween meant nothing. We didn't know when Halloween was. Guy Fawkes night was the big one. And the build-up to it. It's strange when you think it's been going on for several hundred years. And when you think, I mean, it's a sort of a joyous occasion, all standing around, have a big bonfire. Traditionally you would burn an effigy of Guy Fawkes on the fire and you'd let off fireworks. When what it is, of course, it's in commemoration of the defeat, finding out the quashing of a Catholic plot. A Catholic plot to kill King James I and blow up the Houses of Parliament at the same time, in retaliation for the persecution of Catholics in early 17th century England. Guy Fawkes himself wasn't actually the leader, he wasn't the head of the conspiracy. There was a guy by the name of Robert Catesby. So of course in theory it should be called Robert Catesby night, not Guy Fawkes night. You know, Guy Fawkes, I think, has a better ring to it. But Guy Fawkes was the man put in charge of securing all the gunpowder, and he was the man that was found under the Houses of Parliament, because the powers that be received a tip off, and he was found under there with all the barrels of gunpowder. So his is the name that's really gone down in history. And of course, once he was found, he was put to the rack and tortured. And the other conspirators knew that this was going to happen, so they fled London to the countryside. And yeah, he was tortured quite gruesomely, which is what they did in those days. And the other conspirators were tracked down. And there was a shootout when the legal powers caught up with them. Robert Catesby was one of the ones who was killed in the shootout, but many others were taken captive. Of course, they, together with Guy Fawkes, were put on trial for high treason, and not surprisingly were found guilty. I don't think legal representation and justice really came into it much in those days. Although in all fairness, they've estimated that if they'd actually succeeded, the amount of gunpowder that they had actually stored under Parliament would have killed everybody within like a half-mile radius. It would have killed everybody in Parliament, including the King, and just flattened. It was an enormous amount of gunpowder. They would have killed hundreds. But yeah, they were put on trial for treason, found guilty, sentenced to death. And the punishment for treason in those days, as it had been for a couple of hundred years, and was to remain so for quite some time afterwards, was a most cruel and humiliating, deliberately cruel and humiliating execution, which was to be hanged, drawn and quartered. there's been much debate over what the drawn actually relates to, but I think it's generally accepted that it's placed in the wrong order. They were actually drawn through the streets, tied to wooden hurdles, and they'd be beaten and pelted with rubbish by the crowds that had gathered. Some people sentenced didn't actually make it through alive to the execution point. They were beaten to death on the way. Strange times. But yeah, they'd be drawn through the streets on hurdles, beaten, pelted with rubbish to the execution site, where they would be hanged. And what they generally did was they took them up a ladder and put a noose around their neck. And this wasn't a long drop hanging. This was what happened in those days, a slow strangulation hanging. So they'd then be tipped off the ladder and left there to hang for up to maybe half an hour or more until they were close to death by slow strangulation but still conscious. Sorry, this is all a bit stomach churning, but yes, the point is this is what we're celebrating on the 5th of November every year. And while they were still conscious and still alive, they were cut down from the noose, stretched out, they'd be castrated, and then they'd be disemboweled, and their intestines would be pulled out of their body and put onto a fire, an adjacent fire, to burn. Finally, their hearts would be cut out, which would be the end, and then they'd be decapitated and cut into quarters. Their body would be cut into quarters. The heads would generally end up on spikes over London Bridge, and the quarters would be sent to various places around the country to be displayed as a warning to those who might have treason in mind, that this is what's going to happen to you. Lovely stuff. A good reason for setting off a few fireworks. Guy Fawkes himself actually partially cheated the executioner, because even though he'd been weakened by severe torture, when he was taken up the ladder, as soon as they put the noose around his neck, he jumped, which is going to be, jumped up, down, dropped, and his neck snapped. His neck snapped. His neck snapped. I do apologise for this. I haven't been drinking that much. But yeah, his neck snapped and he died instantly. So he was spared the rest of the fairly horrific punishment that was to follow. Which the rest were then subjected to. And that's what we celebrate in the UK on every 5th of November. The thwarting, that was the word I was looking for, the thwarting of the gunpowder plot and the torture and execution of the conspirators. Which, as I say, we celebrate by normally having a bonfire, an effigy of Guy Fawkes, and letting off fireworks. The funny thing is about the bonfire and burning the effigy is, of course, male conspirators found guilty of treason were hanged, drawn and quartered. But in the interests of public decency, any women found guilty of treason were not. They were burned at the stake instead. It's nice to see that. Yeah, they had certain standards in those days. So there you are. I hope you enjoyed that little tale about Guy Fawkes and the gunpowder plot. And and that you enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening and your week ahead. Some of the tracks on this album are really good. Some are very dated, but some are really good. This is a good one. And the one that's went before. In the meantime, it only remains for me to wish you a happy Sunday evening. I'll go off and watch a bit of telly. Watched a great old British film from the 50s before I made this. Hobson's Choice with Charles Lawton and John Mills. If you haven't seen that and you like a nice old black and white 1950s British film, the acting is incredible in it. Highly recommend it. I was at a loose end last night, so I put on a DVD of Clockwork Orange and watched that for the first time in a long while. But that's another story. It only remains for me to say once again, I've probably said it several times now, I hope you have a great weekend and I hope you have a fantastic week ahead, and take care everyone, you and your loved ones. I hope you're safe, well and warm. Cheers. Ta-da!